Welcome back to another episode of Worldbuilding Praxis, where we are building a fantasy world from scratch for use as a D&D campaign setting. In the previous episode, we constructed the foundation atop which our adventures will take place, using tectonics to build a continent. In this episode, we are going to breathe some life into our setting, using large-scale patterns of climate to define the natural regions of our continent, its biomes. Since our biomes are going to depend on the climates of the various regions of our continent, that's where we're going to start. And our climates are dictated by temperature, elevation, and rainfall. The first step of designing our climate is getting the winds moving. And like a lot of big earth science stuff, we must start with the sun. The sun heats the entire Earth, but the equator receives the most concentrated heat. Hot air is less dense, so it travels up until it is pushed towards the pole by the air rising below it. This process, combined with the Coriolis effect, creates three large convection cells in both the northern and the southern hemispheres. These cells drive our planet's larger wind patterns. Now is as good a point as any to give the big world-building caveat. This stuff is complicated, I'm skipping a lot, and simplifying the rest. If you want to go super in-depth with this stuff, I will once again recommend the Worldbuilding Pasta blog. I'm not affiliated with it at all, I just think it's really cool. Now is also a good time to warn you that we are going to be making at least 6 continental maps during the world-building process. So make sure you have some copies of your basic continental map, the one with just your landmasses outlines. If you're doing this digitally, it is probably as easy as copy-paste. But if you're doing it by hand, I would make a few photocopies to use as the bases of your maps moving forward, keeping the original just black on white. That way, if you need more copies in the future, they come out nice and clean. As far as weather patterns are concerned, which happen to be what we're interested in, the biggest and most direct influence comes from the portions of these systems which are nearest the ground, which we call the prevailing winds. These larger patterns create bands of similarly facing winds every 30 degrees or so as you travel away from the equator. The Coriolis effect doesn't just affect our planet's wind, though. It is also acting on its oceans. This results in clockwise currents in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise currents down south. These large circular currents are called gyres. Gyres carry warm equatorial water poleward and pull cold polar water back towards lower latitudes. But our gyres are not perfect circles. These streams of water can't go through continents, so they end up getting diverted, sometimes in unpredictable ways. A good example from Earth is the Gulf Stream. Because of a sharp corner on North America's east coast, a huge amount of warm equatorial water is shot north and east. This water carries its heat with it and serves to significantly increase temperatures all over Europe, resulting in many of the inhabiting countries' climates being much warmer than other places at similar latitudes. All of that said, since we are concentrating on one continent, we are not going to map our entire globe's ocean currents. But we can expect warmer temperatures where warmer water is flowing and vice versa. Also, if there is a region whose climate we want to tweak, maybe its strange climate is because of some undiscovered continent out there, creating some irregular ocean currents. Now that we've sorted the air and the sea, let's get back on solid ground. The first climate driver we are going to concentrate on is temperature. When it comes to our continent's temperature, latitude is the most important factor. Just like in the oceans and in the atmosphere, areas near the equator receive the most concentrated sun heat. So we're going to mark a band between the equator and around 20 degrees latitude as our tropics. Using the Köppen classification, these are areas which do not get cooler than about 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Between around 20 and 40 degrees latitude, we have our temperate zones. These are areas whose coldest month will average somewhere between 32 and 64 degrees Fahrenheit. As we travel poleward, we will enter the continental temperature group, between 40 and 70 degrees latitude. This region's coldest months will average below freezing, while its hottest months will average warmer than 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And finally, we have our polar regions, located between around 70 degrees latitude and the pole. and they are gonna be cold. Our region's elevations are going to factor into their temperatures as well. To keep things simple, we are going to designate 3 levels of elevation: flattish, raised, and alpine. Flattish areas are our baseline. Raised areas will be a little cooler, and alpine areas will be much colder. In the previous episode, our tectonics built some mountains, as well as a rift valley. So we already have a rough topography of our continent. But I'm going to mark a few more raised areas to make our landscape a little more diverse. Now it's time to get the rains flowing. Because of windswept moisture from oceans and the thresholds of different pressures created by our global wind system, latitudes where winds converge are going to be wetter, and vice versa. So, in general, the arrows denoting our prevailing winds are pointing towards areas of more precipitation. This creates some belts of high rainfall near the equator and the 60-degree latitude lines, with drier belts near the 30-degree lines and the poles. In addition, areas near coastlines, especially near warm ocean currents, are generally going to have heavier rainfall than they would otherwise. With these steps, we have established a baseline level of precipitation for the regions of our continent. And we would be ready to fill in our biomes if our continent were totally flat. But of course it isn't. Areas of raised elevation lead to orographic rainfall, meaning the mountains force the wetter air upwards, the air cools, and the moisture falls to the ground as rain before it can make it past the raised area. This means that it will be rainier on the windward side of a mountain range, while it will be more arid and deserty on the leeward side. I mentioned in the previous episode that our continent was about on par in size with South America. But say we expanded it, bringing it closer in that respect to Pangaea. We would be approaching supercontinent territory. A supercontinent is so large that the prevailing winds cannot carry rainfall to all of it. The moisture carried by our arrows is continuously falling as precipitation, so eventually that moisture peters out due to the continent's sheer size. This results in massive interior deserts. Building a supercontinent with this fertile exterior, barren interior layout is an idea I've toyed around with a few times but haven't ever done. A sweeping central desert sounds like a really cool environment to run a resource managey survival adventure, a la archaeological expeditions into the Gobi. But that's a tangent for another time. Finally, we are ready to fill in our continent's biomes. First, we're going to mark off our more extreme environments, starting with some tundras at the tops of our mountains, and then some deserts on the leeward sides of mountain ranges. If it were not glaringly evident at this point, I'm not much of a visual artist. So when I'm map making, I try to keep things pretty simple. For this map, I'm going with a sketchier style, but you can certainly just denote your biomes with color coding or by marking their borders. Since it is well outside of my expertise, I'm going to generally stay away from any sort of visual art advice in this series. The few things I will say are: 1, a bunch of small, undetailed elements can make the larger whole seem much more intricate, and 2, a little bit of shading goes a long way. Just make sure all your shadows are cast at the same angle. I know to many of those watching this stuff is pretty obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me when I was starting out. Next, we'll turn our attention to the tropics. Widespread rainforests cover the flat areas of our tropical zone, with mixed forests in the foothills of any mountain ranges. I didn't go over the types of biomes, but there are plenty of resources out there which do just that. We're going to be pretty general in our classifications, but if you want an idea of just how granular biomes can get, I would check out ecoregions.appspot.com. In our temperate zone, the areas with low rainfall result in prairies or grasslands, while the temperate areas of high rainfall will be covered in deciduous forests at southern latitudes, eventually becoming mixed forests as they reach northward. Note that our continent happens to be in the northern hemisphere. It's always good to expand one's perspective, so I usually try and avoid making continents that are analogs of North America, which happens to be where I live. But because of this tendency of mine, the last 3 continents I have built have been in the southern hemisphere, and I was aching for a bit of variety. So we've come full circle and found ourselves back in the north. If your continent, or part of it, happens to reach into the southern hemisphere, remember to flip the directions of your wind and ocean patterns, as the Coriolis effect will be acting in the opposite direction relative to the equator. Traveling northward into the continental zone, our forests will become increasingly coniferous until its areas of high rainfall are covered by the taiga, or boreal forest biome. If you aren't sure what biome should inhabit a particular region of your continent, or if you just want a clearer idea of what they look like, don't be afraid to look to the real world for help. Find a region of Earth that has a similar-ish geography to that of the region in question, and use that for inspiration. Earth has some pretty crazy geographical layouts, which result in certain biomes that you'd never expect being right next to each other. Just remember, no matter how wacky the biome layout of one of your regions gets, it is still probably pretty simple compared to that of Chile. The foothills of any mountains this far from the equator will be increasingly coniferous as well, and certain areas of high altitude in this zone will receive less rainfall than they would otherwise. So we can toss in some montane shrublands, which, for simplicity, I'll just call plateaus. Our continent doesn't reach into the Arctic Circle, but if it did, our taigas would give way to tundras as we continued to the north. To finish up, I'm going to add a few more bits of detail, clean up our biome shading, and add some contours to our coastline. And with that, we have injected some life into our continent. We know our general patterns of climate and biota, have created some geographical regions, and have set the stage perfectly for civilization to emerge. Tune in next time to Step 3, where we will design our ancient empires, divide our world's timeline into eras, and shape our continent's history with a few world-shaking events. One more quick thing before I go. I have said something along these lines in the past, but I think it bears repeating. The point of my videos is to get you thinking about what you are interested in, and to provide a very general roadmap for the world building process. They are never meant to put obstacles in front of you. Whether it's one of my videos, the DMG, or some other resource, reference materials should only be used as long as they are useful. If at any point in this series you find yourself stuck in the mud, or something just doesn't really click with you, always default back to what makes the most sense to you and what you think is coolest. I am of the opinion that you should almost never retrofit something that you have already done and are content with just because a guide or a reference did it differently. If it gives you motivation and gets you writing, you are probably on the right track. Thank you so much for watching, and I really do appreciate all of the kind words that were left after the last few videos. If you want to support me, you can do all of the normal stuff down here, or head over to the DMs Guild and pick up a copy of Principles of Shamanism. See ya.